You search for answers in the dark, sifting through static and shadows for something that makes sense, but some things aren't meant to be understood. You're about to hear stories that blur the line between memory and nightmare. Enter the world of true horror stories and subscribe, but only if you're really not afraid. Seriously. The Icebreaker Wake. Petty Officer Second Class. Ava Reyes believed in three things during her tour on the Bering Sea: the absolute authority of the captain, the structural integrity of the USCGC Healy, and the unrelenting, soul-crushing cold. Her world was a 420-foot bubble of reinforced steel, a sovereign territory of procedure and protocol, adrift in a universe of gray water and grayer skies. The February of 1994 was particularly brutal, a month that felt like a single, unending twilight, where the ice pack grew like a crystalline disease, threatening to choke the shipping lanes entirely. Their mission was simple: to keep the artery open for the crabbing fleet, a task that translated to days of mind-numbing transit, the rhythmic shudder of the hull chewing through ice sheets, the only percussion in a symphony of engine drone and howling wind. Ava was a radar specialist, her life measured in the slow, hypnotic sweep of a green line across a dark screen. She could identify the signature of a fishing vessel at 20 nautical miles, could distinguish a growler from a Bergie bit by the quality of its return, and she knew the vast, crushing emptiness of the sea as an intimate, personal truth. Her station in the Combat Information Center was a sanctuary of warmth and low light, a stark contrast to the elemental chaos just inches away on the other side of the steel. The Healy was a city unto itself, and like any city, it had its own routines, its own ghosts. The crew whispered stories on long watches, tales of ghost ships in the fog, and the strange, melancholic songs they said the ice sometimes sang under extreme pressure. Eva, a child of the Arizona desert, filed these away as sea folly, the natural consequence of sensory deprivation and isolation. The ocean was a physical force, governed by physics, not phantoms. Her instruments were her gospel, and they had never once lied to her. The incident, as it would later be noted in the official log, began on a Tuesday. The sea was unusually calm, the water a flat, metallic sheet that mirrored the bruised purple of the sky. The Healy was carving a clean channel through thinner ice, leaving a turbulent wake of foam and shattered plates that stretched for miles behind them. It was Ensign Davis who saw it first, a young, eager officer on his first Arctic tour, standing watch on the fantail. His voice over the internal comm was tight with confusion, not alarm. He reported a small vessel, a skiff he called it, trailing them in the wake. The captain, a man whose patience had been worn thin by the long winter, demanded a clarification. A skiff? Out here? Hundreds of miles from the nearest coastline? It was impossible. A clear mistake. Ava's fingers were already dancing across her console, her eyes scanning the familiar emptiness of her radar screen. Nothing. The system was performing a perfect diagnostic sweep, its sensitivity cranked to maximum. There were ice flows, atmospheric clutter, the distant ghost of the Alaskan mainland, but no vessel, not a fishing boat, not a pleasure craft, and certainly not a tiny open-hulled skiff. She keyed her mic, her voice calm and professional. "Bridge, CIC, radar is clear. I have no contact astern. Repeat, no contact." The reply from the bridge was clipped. They were sending another man to the fantail with a pair of stabilized binoculars. Ava trusted her equipment, but a visual confirmation from a second party was standard procedure. She watched the internal camera feed from the stern, a grainy black and white image. She could see the two figures, bundled against the cold, staring back into the churning path they had cut through the ice. A few minutes later, the second report came in. This one from a seasoned chief petty officer with 20 years of sea time. His voice lacked the ensign's uncertainty. It was firm, laced with a profound sense of disbelief. Bridge, Fantail confirms the visual. It's a small boat, maybe 16 feet. Looks like a Boston whaler. Single occupant. It's just riding our wake, keeping pace. The Combat Information Center fell silent. Eva ran another dozen diagnostic sweeps. She rebooted the secondary system. She patched into the more powerful surface search radar, typically reserved for military threats. The result was always the same: an empty ocean, a ghost. The captain ordered them to log it as a possible mirage, a trick of the light and the ice fog, a phenomenon known as a fata morgana. But this felt different. Mirages shimmered, they distorted, they did not hold a steady course for hours on end. Eva stayed glued to her station. Long after her watch had ended, she pulled the high-resolution video feed from the stern-mounted camera, the one used for documenting ice-breaking operations. She scrubbed through the footage, frame by excruciating frame. There was the wake, a brilliant white scar on the dark water. There were the shattered pieces of ice, bobbing like debris from a shipwreck. There was nothing else. The crew who had seen it were adamant. They described the boat in detail. Its faded red hull, the dark shape of the figure inside, huddled over an outboard motor that produced no sound and no exhaust. They swore it followed them until the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery, apocalyptic colors. As darkness enveloped the Healy, the skiff simply wasn't there anymore. It didn't speed away. It didn't fall behind. It just ceased to exist between one heartbeat and the next. Eva was tasked with compiling the final report. She had the eyewitness testimonies of 4 decorated sailors. She had her own radar logs, a testament to a clear and empty sea, and she had the video, hours of it, showing nothing but water. It was a paradox, a trinity of contradictory evidence. She logged the official entry as instructed, using the dry, passive language of naval bureaucracy: unidentified surface visual, uncorroborated by sensor data, attributed to atmospheric conditions. But as she typed the words, she felt a profound chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic air. It was a cold that crept up from the deepest, most ancient parts of the ocean, a place where the rules of physics were merely suggestions. For the rest of her tour, Eva Reyes found herself glancing at the stern camera feed, her finger hovering over the record button. She would stare into the churning foam of the wake, half expecting, half dreading to see the little red boat emerge from the chaos, its silent passenger keeping a patient, eternal watch. She never saw it again, but sometimes when the sea was flat and the light was strange, she could almost convince herself she saw a second wake running parallel to their own, a phantom track left by a vessel that existed only in the fractured memories of a handful of sailors, a ghost forever bound to the frozen heart of the Bering Sea. The official logbook from February of 1994 holds her entry, a single line item buried among reports of engine maintenance and weather observations. It remains a quiet, official testament to a day when the most advanced vessel in the Coast Guard fleet was followed by something that, according to every instrument on board, simply was not there. The blown drift station doctor, Alistair Finch, considered himself a custodian of the cold. His domain was a vast, unforgiving expanse of tundra near Nome, Alaskan, Alaska, a place where the wind was the only true architect. sculpting the snow into waves and dunes that mimicked a frozen ocean. As a NOAA meteorologist, his job was to maintain a network of automated weather stations, little robotic outposts that tirelessly reported the brutal language of the Arctic climate. They were his children, in a way, scattered across the wilderness. Their periodic data transmissions, a comforting pulse of life in the silent white. He knew their quirks. The way Station Delta's anemometer would freeze in a northeasterly gale, or how Gamma's solar panel needed to be cleared after every significant snowfall. He lived alone in a small, well-insulated research cabin, his only companions the howl of the wind and the crackle of the radio. It was a life of profound isolation, but Alistair thrived on it. The solitude sharpened his senses, attuned him to the subtle rhythms of the land. The incident occurred in the dead of January 2008, a time of year the locals called the deep freeze, when the sun was a brief, apologetic smear on the southern horizon. Alistair was monitoring the network feed when an anomaly appeared. It came from Station Epsilon, the most remote of his charges, a full day's ski trip away. The station was transmitting its usual data packet: temperature, wind speed, barometric pressure, all within expected parameters. But appended to the data was a flag he had never seen before: a manual entry code. It was a failsafe, a feature designed for a technician on site to input notes directly into the system using a small, ruggedized keypad inside the station's housing. The code indicated a human hand had just interacted with the station. Alistair's first thought was vandalism. Perhaps a hunter or a snowmobiler had stumbled upon the hut and tried to break in. It was a violation, a trespass against his carefully ordered world. He radioed the regional office, informing them he was going to investigate. They advised against it. A storm was forecast to roll in within 48 hours, but Alistair was resolute. Epsilon was his responsibility. He packed his survival gear, strapped on his cross-country skis, and set out at the first hint of dawn. The journey was arduous, a grueling battle against the wind and the biting cold. The landscape was a monstrous abstraction of white on white, the sky and earth bleeding into one another. He navigated by compass and the familiar shape of distant wind-scoured ridges. It took him nearly 10 hours to reach the station's coordinates. What he found stopped him dead in his tracks. The snowdrift was massive, a solid, compacted wave of white that had completely engulfed the area. Of Station Epsilon, there was no sign. It was gone, buried. He knew immediately what had happened. A ground blizzard, a common and terrifying phenomenon where high winds pick up fallen snow, creating a blinding, scouring storm that can bury structures in a matter of hours. The station, a small fiberglass hut bolted to a steel frame, must have collapsed under the immense weight. His anger at the supposed vandals evaporated, replaced by a cold dread. He had been so sure. He pulled out his portable receiver and checked the signal. Epsilon was still broadcasting, not just its automated data, but that same manual entry flag, repeating on its hourly cycle. How was that possible? The station was destroyed, driven by a frantic scientific curiosity that bordered on obsession. Alistair began to dig. For 2 hours, he worked with his small emergency shovel, chipping away at the iron-hard snow. Finally, the shovel struck something with a dull thud. He cleared the area and uncovered the crushed yellow roof of the hut. The structure had been flattened, the walls buckled inward, the frame twisted into a grotesque sculpture of failed engineering. It was a tomb, yet, somehow, the electronics inside were still drawing power from the buried solar panel and transmitting their ghostly signal. He managed to pry open a ruined hatch, wriggling his way into the cramped, dark space. The air inside was still and frigid. His headlamp beam cut through the gloom, revealing a scene of total devastation. Equipment was shattered, papers were frozen into a solid block of ice. But the instrument panel, miraculously, was intact. A single green light blinked rhythmically on the transmitter. And then he saw the keypad. It was a simple 12-button interface, sealed against moisture. His breath caught in his throat. The small LCD screen above it was still active, displaying the last entry. It wasn't a random string of numbers, not the result of a malfunction. It was a sequence, typed deliberately after the station had been crushed and buried. The sequence was simple, a repeating pattern of numbers that held no obvious meaning. But the timestamp, the one that corresponded with the flag he had received back at his cabin, was clear. The entry had been made just hours before he had set out. Someone, or something, had been inside this crushed, buried tomb in the absolute heart of a blizzard, and had carefully, methodically, typed a message into a dead machine. A shiver traced its way down Alistair's spine, a fear more profound than the cold. He was alone, miles from any human settlement, standing in a place that defied all logic. He backed out of the wreckage, his mind reeling. The storm was coming. The sky was already turning a slate gray. He had to leave. As he skied away, he didn't dare look back. He felt as though he were being watched from the ruins, from the impossible space within the crushed hut. The signal from Station Epsilon continued for another 3 days, each hourly transmission carrying the same cryptic, manual flag. Then, as the new storm reached its peak, it went silent forever. Alistair Finch never spoke of what he saw inside the hut. His official report stated that Station Epsilon was lost in a ground blizzard, its structure compromised by high winds and snow load. The manual entry flag was dismissed as a data corruption event, a final electronic gasp from a dying machine. But Alistair knew better. He knew that for a few hours, something had occupied that ruined space. Something that didn't need to breathe, that didn't feel the cold, and that had left a message from a place no living thing could ever have been. He had gone out seeking a vandal and had found a ghost in the machine, a silent witness to the endless, unknowable heart of the Alaskan winter. The fishing derby boat. Leo Gower loved the Homer fishing derby more than he loved just about anything else. For one weekend every June, the sleepy fishing town on Kachamak Bay transformed into a bustling hub of excitement and friendly competition. Leo, a retired harbor master with salt in his veins and a network of wrinkles around his eyes that told of 1,000 sunrises over the water, served as a volunteer race marshal. His station was a small folding chair at the end of the spit, armed with a pair of high-powered binoculars, a clipboard, and a radio that crackled with the chatter of the fleet. His job was simple: to visually confirm and log every boat that crossed the official finish line, a pair of bright orange buoys bobbing in the inlet. The year was 1981, and the derby was in full swing. The weather was perfect, a rare Alaskan gem of a day with a high, thin veil of clouds and a sea as calm as a mill pond. Boats were streaming in, their crews jubilant, holding up massive halibut and king salmon for the crowds on shore. Leo's pen flew across his logbook, a steady rhythm of hull numbers, vessel names, and crossing times. It was a familiar, comforting chaos. He knew most of these boats by sight: the Seawolf with its distinctive green trim, the Northern Star which always listed slightly to port, the Lucky Penny with its perpetually peeling paint, It was late in the afternoon, with the cutoff time fast approaching, when he saw it. The boat was a classic wooden troller, a design you didn't see much anymore. Solid and graceful, cutting cleanly through the water. It was painted a deep, almost black shade of blue. It looked well-maintained but old, a relic from a different era. It crossed the finish line with no fanfare, no horns, no cheering crew on deck. In fact, the deck appeared to be empty. Leo raised his binoculars, frowning. That was a safety violation right there. You always had a watch on deck coming into the harbor. He focused on the hull, searching for the name and registry number. The name was painted over, but the hull number was clearly visible, stenciled in white just below the gunnel. He jotted it down, AK-7713E, and keyed his radio. Harbor Control, Marshal Gower. I have a visual on vessel AK-7713E, crossing the line now. Can you confirm their registration for the Derby? The reply from the harbor office was tinny and confused. Negative, Marshal. We have no vessel with that number on the Derby roster. Stand by. Checking the main registry, Leo kept the trawler in his sights. It was moving differently from the other boats, not heading for the weigh-in station or the main docks. It was gliding silently toward the old cannery pilings, a part of the harbor that was largely abandoned. The radio crackled again, the voice from the office now tinged with something other than confusion. It was disbelief. Leo, you're not going to believe this. Hull number AK-7713E belongs to a boat called the Albatross. It was a trawler, just like you described. But Leo, the Albatross was lost with all hands in a storm off the Barren Islands. In 1953, the registry lists her as decommissioned, presumed sunk. A cold knot tightened in Leo's stomach. He looked from his clipboard to the boat, which was now partially obscured by the rotting pilings. It couldn't be. Clerical errors happened. People repainted old hull numbers. It was a common shortcut. There had to be a rational explanation. He stood up, shielding his eyes from the low sun, and took out his camera, a simple point and shoot he used to document any disputes. He snapped a half-dozen photos of the vessel as it slipped further into the shadows of the old pier. He called back to the harbor office. Get a launch ready. I'm going to go have a word with this skipper. Something's not right. He jogged down the spit towards the main dock, his mind racing. A ghost ship? In the middle of the fishing derby, on a clear, sunny afternoon? It was absurd. It was the kind of story old fishermen told after too many beers at the Salty Dog Saloon. It took less than 10 minutes to get a small harbor patrol boat untied and running, with a young auxiliary officer at the helm. They motored quickly toward the old cannery. But when they arrived, there was nothing there. The water between the pilings was empty, lapping gently against the creosote-soaked wood. There was no sign of the deep blue trawler. They circled the area for 20 minutes. It couldn't have just vanished. Even with its engine off, it would have drifted. There was no place for it to hide. It was simply gone. Back in the office, a strange quiet had fallen over the staff. Leo developed his film in the small dark room they kept for official use. As the images materialized in the chemical bath, his blood ran cold. The photos were clear. The lighting was perfect. He could see the other boats, the finish line buoys, the distant mountains. But where the blue trawler should have been, there was only empty water. It wasn't in a single frame. It was as if his camera had refused to see what his eyes and his binoculars had seen so clearly. He was left with nothing but a log entry. a hull number connected to a tragedy from a generation past, and the unshakable memory of a silent, empty boat crossing a finish line it had no right to reach. The official Derby results for 1981 show no record of the albatross. The incident was chalked up to a long day in the sun, a trick of the light, a mistaken identity. But Leo Gower never worked as a race marshal again. For the rest of his life, whenever he looked out over the calm waters of the bay, he would find his eyes drawn to the old cannery pilings, forever searching for the dark blue hull of a boat that had come home from the sea 30 years too late. The abandoned fire lookout ranger. Ben Carter knew the Tongass National Forest as well as he knew the lines on his own hands. For 15 years, he had patrolled its vast, silent expanse of ancient trees, mist-shrouded fjords, and snow-capped peaks. He was a man who preferred the company of spruce and hemlock to people, a man who could read the story of a season in a broken branch or a set of tracks in the mud. He understood the forest's moods, its sudden furies, and its deep, abiding peace. His world was one of predictable natural cycles. So when he saw the smoke, a thin gray tendril rising against the deep green of the mountainside, his entire sense of order was disrupted. It wasn't just any smoke. Its location was precise and impossible. It was coming from the Devil's Thumb Lookout Tower, a structure that had been officially decommissioned and sealed up since the late 1970s. Ben had personally screwed the steel shutters over its windows and bolted the door from the outside 5 years prior during a routine survey. No one should be up there. His mind immediately jumped to squatters or careless hikers. With the forest as dry as it had been that August of 1999, an unauthorized fire was a catastrophic risk. He radioed in his position and his intention to investigate, his voice tight with a mixture of annoyance and concern. The hike to the lookout was a brutal 3-hour climb, a steep, overgrown trail that switchbacked relentlessly up the mountain. As he ascended, the smell of wood smoke grew stronger, a clean, pleasant scent of burning pine that was utterly at odds with the growing unease in his gut. He crested the final ridge and saw the tower, a lonely wooden box on the stilts perched on the edge of a granite cliff. And the smoke was real, curling lazily from the small tin chimney pipe on its roof. He approached cautiously, his hand resting on the can of bear spray on his hip. He called out, his voice sounding small against the immense silence of the wilderness. U.S. Forest Service. Anyone in there? No answer. He circled the base of the tower. The heavy bolt he had installed on the door was gone, not broken or forced, but cleanly removed. The door itself was slightly ajar. He pushed it open and climbed the steep, narrow stairs, the wood groaning under his weight. The air in the single room at the top was warm, almost cozy. A small pot-bellied stove in the corner glowed with embers, a cast-iron kettle sitting on top, letting off a faint wisp of steam. A tin coffee pot and a mug sat on the simple wooden table. A sleeping bag was unrolled neatly on the cot, and a worn copy of a paperback novel lay face down on the pillow. A backpack leaned against the wall, its pockets bulging. It looked for all the world like a Forest Service ranger had just stepped out for a moment. But there were no other rangers assigned to this sector. And this tower was supposed to be empty, cold, and dead. A deep, primal sense of wrongness washed over Ben. He felt like an intruder in a place that shouldn't exist. He checked the logbook on the desk, a dusty tome left behind decades ago. The last entry was dated 1978. He walked to the windows, peering through the glass at the breathtaking panorama of the forest below. There was no sign of anyone. No tracks on the trail he hadn't made himself. No movement in the trees. Where had the occupant gone? It was as if they had simply evaporated into the mountain air. He radioed back to his supervisor, explaining the bizarre situation. They agreed he should stay the night to see if the mysterious visitor returned. As dusk fell, Ben settled in for a long, tense watch. He didn't touch the stove or the gear, leaving everything exactly as he had found it. The warmth from the embers slowly faded, and a deep, penetrating cold began to seep into the small cabin. The silence of the high country pressed in, broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind. He must have dozed off because he awoke with a start in the gray pre-dawn light, a stiff and cold ache in his bones. The first thing he noticed was the cold. The cabin was frigid, the air sharp and biting. He looked at the stove. It was stone cold, its door shut tight, not a hint of warmth remaining. He looked at the table. The coffee pot and mug were gone. The kettle was gone. He turned to the cot. The sleeping bag had vanished. The book was no longer on the pillow. The backpack that had been leaning against the wall was gone. The room was exactly as he had left it 5 years ago. Empty, derelict, and dead. He frantically searched the small space, his heart pounding against his ribs. There was no way anyone could have entered, removed all those items, and left without him waking. The stairs were too loud, the door too creaky. It was impossible. He stumbled down the stairs and out onto the balcony, his breath pluming in the icy air. He looked at the chimney. It was cold, with no trace of smoke or soot. He looked at the door. The heavy bolt was back in place, securely fastened from the outside, just as he had left it years ago. It was as if his entire experience from the previous day had been a hyper-realistic dream, a hallucination brought on by the strenuous climb. But he knew it wasn't. He remembered the warmth of the stove, the smell of the coffee, the weight of the book in his hand. He had been there. He had seen it. His official patrol log for August 1999 contains a brief, sanitized entry. It notes that he investigated a report of smoke near Devil's Thumb, which he attributed to a possible lightning strike causing a temporary smolder in the surrounding forest floor. There is no mention of the open door, the warm stove, or the phantom occupant. Ben Carter never hiked to that lookout tower again. He couldn't shake the feeling that for one afternoon, he had stepped into a fold in time, a moment where the tower was still alive, occupied by a lonely watcher from a bygone era, a ranger whose shift had never truly ended. He had shared a space with a memory, a ghost of routine and duty that still haunted that high, lonely peak, forever watching over the vast, silent forest below. The cliffside calls. For Maya Chen, rock climbing was a form of meditation. It was a vertical chess game against the raw, indifferent face of a mountain, a discipline that demanded absolute focus and trust. The granite cliffs near Seward, Alaska, were her cathedral, a place of stark beauty and profound challenge. In July of 2012, she was leading a small, experienced group on a new route up a formation known as the Weeping Wall. It was a demanding climb, and they were in constant radio contact with each other and with the local search and rescue base, a standard safety protocol in such a remote area. They were about halfway up the ascent, secured to the cliff face 1,000 feet above the valley floor, when the call came through. It wasn't on their private channel. It was a broadcast bleeding over the emergency frequency, a voice, faint and distorted by static. Mayday, mayday. Climber fall. Weeping Wall. Coordinates repeat: 60.11 north, 149.43 west. The voice was strained, panicked, and it sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through Maya's system. She immediately relayed the call to the SAR base. The dispatcher confirmed they were hearing it too. A weak, looping signal. The problem was the coordinates. Maya checked her own GPS. The coordinates the voice was repeating were not somewhere down in the valley or on an adjacent peak. They were for a location on the very cliff face they were currently on. About 200 feet directly to their left, it was a sheer, unforgiving slab of granite, a section of the wall so smooth and featureless that it was considered completely unclimbable. There was no ledge, no crevice, nothing a falling climber could have possibly landed on. The SAR team asked her to be their eyes and ears until a helicopter could be scrambled. Hanging from her harness, Maya carefully traversed as close as she dared to the specified location. The panicked voice kept repeating its ghostly message on the radio, a desperate, fading loop. Using her binoculars, she scanned the rock face. Nothing. There was no sign of a fallen climber, no broken gear, no scrape marks. There was just the cold, hard reality of the stone. Then she saw them. They were faint, almost invisible against the gray granite, but they were unmistakably there. Handprints, not the full, smudged marks of a desperate grab, but the distinct white outlines of fingers and palms, rendered in climbing chalk. They were arranged in a scattered, impossible pattern across the sheer slab, as if someone had been walking up the vertical face with their bare hands. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over her, a fear that had nothing to do with the height. This was wrong. This was profoundly, fundamentally wrong. The SAR helicopter arrived 20 minutes later, a noisy, welcome intrusion into the terrifying silence. It hovered near the cliff, its rotors whipping up a furious wind. A rescuer was lowered on a winch, dangling in the air as he scanned the same section of rock. His voice came over the radio, calm but baffled. "Base, this is Rescue 1. I have a visual on the coordinates. There's nothing here. The rock is bare. Repeat, the wall is bare." Maya stared in disbelief. From her vantage point, the chalk prints were still visible. How could he not see them? She keyed her mic, her voice trembling slightly. "Rescue 1, look again. There are chalk prints all over that section. I can see them from here." There was a pause. Then the rescuer's voice returned, heavy, with a patient professionalism that bordered on pity. "Ma'am, with all due respect, there is nothing here. Maybe it's a trick of the light. Some kind of mineral deposit on the rock." The helicopter moved on, beginning a wider search pattern of the area as a precaution. The voice on the emergency channel continued its desperate, looping plea. It seemed to be getting weaker, fading in and out. Maya and her team, their own climb now forgotten, could only cling to the wall and listen, helpless witnesses to a tragedy that seemed to be happening in another dimension. The search was eventually called off as night fell. No missing climber reports had been filed. No abandoned vehicles were found at the trailhead. The official conclusion was that the distress call had been a ghost transmission, a freak atmospheric event causing a distant signal to bounce off the mountainside, its coordinates corrupted and meaningless. The SAR team never filed a report about the chalk prints, because according to their best rescuer, they simply weren't there. Maya and her team rappelled down in the twilight, the strange, looping Mayday call finally fading to silence as they descended. But Maya couldn't shake the image of those handprints. They were a testament, a final, desperate message left by someone or something that had met its end on that impossible piece of rock. She knew what she saw. It wasn't a mineral deposit. It was the last trace of a climber who had fallen not down, but upwards into the sky, leaving behind only the ghostly white echo of their final, impossible ascent. The Alaska SAR communication records from that day logged the mysterious signal, noting it as an unresolved anomaly. For Maya, the weeping wall would forever live up to its name, not for the water that seeped from its cracks, but for the memory of a voice that cried out for help from a place no one could reach, and the faint, white handprints that no one else could see. The tarmac mirage. Frank Cole was a creature of the night, a member of the ground crew at Fairbanks International Airport. His world was a sprawling flatland of concrete and asphalt, illuminated by the ghostly orange glow of sodium lamps. He operated in the silent hours between the last departure and the first arrival, a time when the airport belonged to him and his team of de-icers, fuelers, and baggage handlers. The October of 2004 was when the deep cold first began to set in. A dry, sharp cold that made the air glitter and the metal of the aircraft sting to the touch. Frank had seen it all, from emergency landings in whiteout, blizzards, to moose wandering onto the taxiways. He was a man not easily rattled. He was in the cab of his de-icing truck near runway 1L, waiting for a late-arriving cargo plane. When he saw it, it was a plane, a twin-engine propeller craft, maybe a King Air or something similar, taxiing slowly and deliberately from the general aviation hangars. This, in itself, was not unusual. What was unusual was that it was moving without any lights, no navigation lights, no strobes, not even a taxi light to illuminate the path ahead. It was just a dark, silent shape moving through the pools of orange light. Frank's first instinct was professional annoyance. This was a serious breach of protocol. He grabbed his radio. Ground, de-icer 4. Be advised, I have an unlit aircraft on taxiway Bravo, heading for the main apron. Can you confirm? The reply from the control tower was immediate. The controller's voice unconcerned. Negative, de-icer 4. Tower shows the apron is clear. There is no scheduled movement. Say again your visual. Frank squinted, leaning forward in his seat. The plane was undeniable. It was right there, maybe 300 yards away, its propellers turning in a slow, silent arc. Ground, I have eyes on. Twin-engine prop, dark paint. He's on Bravo, approaching the intersection with Charlie. He is running completely dark. He could hear the controller typing in the background. Other voices began to chime in on the frequency. A baggage cart operator near the terminal, another ground crew member in a fuel truck. They all saw it. Ground, this is baggage 2. Yeah, I see him. What's that guy doing? Fuel 1, I got him too. No lights. That's a major violation. The tower controller's voice returned, now edged with a tension that hadn't been there before. All units hold position. I am showing absolutely nothing on surface radar. Let me be clear. The taxiway is empty. Frank felt a prickle of unease. The surface radar was foolproof. It could pick up a coyote on the runway. How could it miss an entire airplane? He watched as the silent aircraft continued its slow, phantom journey, turning onto the main commercial apron and rolling to a stop in an empty gate. A gate that had been assigned to the cargo flight he was waiting for. The propellers spun down into stillness. No ramp extended, no doors opened. It just sat there, a dark, inert shape against the brightly lit terminal. The tower was now in a state of controlled chaos. They were calling the FAA, airport security, everyone. They were convinced it was an emergency, a plane with total electrical failure. Security patrols were dispatched, their flashing blue and red lights a frantic contrast to the silent, dark aircraft. Frank drove his truck closer, keeping a safe distance. He was now close enough to see the windows of the cockpit. They were black, opaque, reflecting the airport lights like the eyes of some colossal insect. There was no sign of a crew, no movement inside at all. He watched as two security vehicles pulled up, parking a respectful distance from the plane's wingtips. He could hear their transmissions on the radio, their voices a mixture of confusion and frustration. They were there, but they were reporting an empty gate. They saw nothing. At that moment, the control tower came back on the radio, their voice strained. All units on the apron, we are reviewing the CCTV footage for that gate. The footage is clear. There is no aircraft at gate B7. I repeat, there is no aircraft. A collective, disbelieving silence fell over the radio channel. Frank was staring at the plane with his own two eyes. 3 other ground crew members were staring at it. Yet the tower, the radar, the security officers on site, and now the security cameras all insisted it wasn't there. It was a mass hallucination, a shared delusion brought on by the cold and the lateness of the hour. But it felt so real. As everyone struggled to process the impossible contradiction, the lights on the tarmac began to flicker. The bright orange lamps lining the taxiway blinked on and off, erratically at first, then in a strange, rhythmic pulse. The lights on the terminal building itself began to fail, plunging sections of the airport into an unsettling darkness. In the midst of this electrical chaos, Frank saw the propellers on the dark aircraft begin to turn again. They spun up with an unnerving silence, a visual impossibility. The plane pushed back from the gate, its movements smooth and ghostly, and began to taxi back the way it had come. It moved through the flickering, dying lights, a specter making its silent departure. By the time the main power breakers were reset and the airport lights returned to their steady, normal glow, it was gone. The tarmac was empty. Gate B7 was vacant. There were no tire tracks, no drops of hydraulic fluid, no physical evidence that anything had been there at all. The FAA apron report for that night in October 2004 logs a significant power fluctuation of unknown origin. It mentions reports of an unconfirmed visual anomaly, but concludes it was likely a tarmac mirage, a distortion caused by a temperature inversion over the cold concrete. But Frank Cole and the other ground crew who saw it know what they witnessed. It wasn't a mirage. It was a visitor, an aircraft from nowhere that existed for a brief time in a space between worlds, a ghost that flew on silent wings, visible only to the lonely watchers of the midnight shift, the winter camp chairs. David Miller was a scout leader, a role he took with a deep, almost paternal seriousness. He believed in teaching kids resilience, self-reliance, and a respect for the wild. His winter camping trip with the Wasilla troop was an annual tradition, a test of skill and character in the stark, beautiful wilderness of the Alaskan backcountry. This trip, in February of 2015, was a small one. Just David and 4 teenage scouts, all of them experienced and well-equipped. They had made camp in a clearing of birch trees, the snow deep and powdery under their boots. The day was spent practicing shelter building and fire making. As night fell, a profound silence descended, the kind that only comes with a fresh blanket of snow. They sat around the crackling campfire, telling stories and roasting marshmallows, their camp chairs arranged in a comfortable tight circle, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. The air was cold but still, the stars brilliant in the black sky. It was a perfect winter night. They doused the fire properly, burying the embers in snow, and retired to their tents, the boys whispering and laughing until they finally drifted off to sleep. David was the last one awake, listening to the quiet rhythm of their breathing and the occasional soft sigh of snow falling from a burdened tree branch. He felt a deep sense of peace. He woke just before dawn, as was his habit, to the faint gray light filtering through the tent fabric. He pulled on his boots and parka and stepped outside, intending to get the stove going for hot chocolate. He stopped, his breath catching in the frigid air. The camp chairs were gone. The small folding canvas chairs that had been in a tight circle around the dead fire pit were simply not there. He scanned the immediate area, a flicker of annoyance rising in him. He assumed it was a prank by the boys, a bit of early morning mischief. He was about to call out to them when he saw the chairs. They were 50 yards away, out in the middle of an open snowfield that bordered their campsite. They were not scattered or tossed about. They were arranged in a perfect, neat circle, identical to the one they had made around the fire. Each chair placed with an almost ceremonial precision, facing inward toward an invisible center. A chill went through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. The snow in the field was a pristine, unbroken blanket. There were no tracks leading to or from the circle of chairs. Not his, not the boys', not even the delicate tracery of an animal. It was as if the chairs had been plucked from the campsite and gently placed there by something that left no impression on the snow. He walked to the edge of the clearing, his own boots sinking deep, leaving obvious, clumsy prints. He examined the scene, his rational mind struggling to find an explanation. The wind? No, the air had been dead calm all night, and the wind wouldn't have arranged them so perfectly. An animal? A bear or a moose would have left a trail a mile wide and likely would have mangled the chairs, not set them up for a meeting. The boys woke up a few minutes later, their sleepy grumbling turning to gasps of confusion as they saw the chairs. They all denied moving them, their faces a mixture of fear and genuine bewilderment. It was then that the youngest scout, a boy named Sam, spoke up, his voice barely a whisper. "I heard something last night. I thought I was dreaming David turned to him." "What did you hear, Sam?" "Boots," the boy said, his eyes wide, "like someone walking. That crunching sound boots make in cold snow. It went on for a long time, just walking around the camp." The other boys nodded, their own memories sparked. They had heard it too, a faint, rhythmic crunching, but had dismissed it as part of a dream or the sound of one of their friends getting up in the night. David's blood ran cold. He was a light sleeper in the woods, attuned to every snap of a twig. He had heard nothing. He walked back to the circle of chairs, his heart pounding. The tracks he was looking for were there, right next to the chairs themselves. The snow was compressed and disturbed directly underneath and around each chair, the kind of marks that would be made by someone carrying the chair, stopping, and carefully placing it down. They were human marks, but the trail leading to them, the approach, was completely missing. The story didn't add up. How could someone move the chairs without leaving a path? He tried to rationalize it. Maybe a strong gust of wind had somehow skated the chairs across the hard-packed crust of a previous snowfall. and the new light powder had covered the tracks, but it didn't feel right. The precision of the circle, the neatness of it all, spoke of intent, not chaos. They packed up their camp in a tense, nervous silence. The boys kept looking over their shoulders, into the dark, silent woods that surrounded them. David retrieved the chairs, the simple act of folding them feeling strangely like disturbing a sacred site. The trip was cut short. The feeling of peaceful solitude had been shattered, replaced by an oppressive sense of being watched, of having trespassed in a place governed by unseen, inexplicable rules. The official incident note David filed with the Scout Council was brief and vague. It mentioned unusual environmental conditions that made the Scouts uncomfortable, leading to an early departure. He couldn't bring himself to write the truth. It sounded too insane. Who would believe a story about flying chairs and trackless footprints? But David Miller never forgot that morning. He never forgot the perfect empty circle of chairs waiting in the dawn light. A silent invitation to a meeting he could not comprehend. He never forgot the sound of boots that he hadn't heard, and the chilling realization that some things walk through the winter wilderness leaving no trace at all. Their only evidence, the quiet, deliberate rearrangement of the human world, a subtle, terrifying calling card left in the heart of the snow. The Cordova Net Loft. The salmon cannery in Cordova was a place of frantic, seasonal life, a symphony of steam, machinery, and the shouts of fishermen. But for Marco Velez, its true heart was the net loft. It was a vast, cavernous space that smelled of salt, tar, and the deep ocean, a cathedral of industry where gillnets were mended and stored. Marco was a net mender, a master of a dying craft, his hands gnarled and scarred but possessing a dexterity that was almost surgical. He could repair a torn net so perfectly that the seam was stronger than the original mesh. In the summer of 1990, the fishing was good, and the cannery was running day and night. The net loft was Marco's sanctuary from the noisy chaos of the slime line. His ritual was the same every evening. After the last of the boats had unloaded, he and his team would wash the massive nets and hang them from the high rafters to dry overnight. Great curtains of mesh that swayed gently in the drafts. It was a simple, practical task. But that June, something changed. Every morning when Marco arrived before dawn to take the nets down, he found them soaked. Not just damp, but dripping wet, as if they had been dragged through the water only moments before. At first, he blamed the old building. He sent a maintenance crew to inspect the roof, searching for a leak. They found nothing. The corrugated tin was sound, the timbers solid. The shift supervisor logged it as a problem with overnight condensation, a consequence of the humid coastal air and the temperature difference inside the cavernous loft. But Marco knew condensation. Condensation was a fine mist, a dampness you could feel. This was different. The nets were heavy with water, pooling on the concrete floor below, smelling freshly of the salty harbor. It was as if the ocean itself was seeping into the building at night. The workers grew superstitious. They whispered stories of the Nak Nek, the old Tlingit water spirits that were said to claim things left too close to the shore. They started making jokes about the nets going fishing by themselves at night. Marco, a practical man, scoffed at such talk, but the unease was a seed planted in his mind. He had to know what was happening. One night, he convinced the young, skeptical night watchman, a kid named Jimmy, to help him. They set up a video camera on a tripod at one end of the loft, aimed down the long rows of hanging nets. They locked the massive sliding doors from the inside, the only entrance to the building, and settled in for a long, quiet watch from the small foreman's office that overlooked the main floor. For hours, nothing happened. The loft was still and silent. The only sound the distant cry of gulls and the creak of the old building settling. Jimmy was dozing in his chair, and even Marco's resolve was beginning to waver. Maybe it really was just a strange atmospheric quirk. Then, around 3 a.m., it began. It started not with a sound, but with a movement. One of the massive nets, a 100-foot curtain of mesh hanging in the center of the room, began to sway. It wasn't the gentle, random motion of a draft. It was a heavy, rhythmic swing, as if a great weight was being dragged along its length. Marco sat bolt upright, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. Jimmy woke with a start, his eyes wide as he stared at the impossible sight. The net was moving with purpose, its bottom edge dragging along the concrete floor, leaving a wet trail behind it. Then the net next to it began to move, and the one after that, all of them swaying in a slow, synchronized dance. There was no wind. The doors were sealed. There was no one on the floor. Yet the nets were being pulled and tugged by an unseen force, their immense weight manipulated as if they were nothing more than spider webs. Marco grabbed a heavy flashlight, his knuckles white. He was terrified, but his anger and his need for a rational answer were stronger. He slid open the office door and stepped onto the catwalk, shining the powerful beam down onto the floor. The light illuminated the wet concrete, the heavy, swinging nets, and nothing else. There was no intruder, no animal, no hidden machinery, just the eerie, silent motion. He could feel a strange pressure in the air, a damp, cold energy that seemed to emanate from the moving nets. The swaying grew more violent, the nets snapping and pulling against their hooks, the sound of their wet mesh slapping against the floor echoing in the vast space. It felt like a struggle, as if the nets were being hauled by a ghostly crew, an invisible fishing boat passing straight through the building. The ordeal lasted for maybe 10 minutes, though it felt like an eternity. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The nets fell still, hanging limp and heavy, dripping water onto the floor. The oppressive feeling in the air dissipated, leaving behind only the profound, echoing silence of the loft. Marco and Jimmy didn't speak. They just stood there, staring, their minds unable to process what they had just witnessed. When morning came, they rewound the videotape. The footage was grainy, the light poor, but it was all there. They watched the nets begin to sway. They saw them drag across the floor. They witnessed the entire impossible event. It was undeniable proof. But when they showed it to the cannery supervisor, he saw something different. He pointed to the way the image jumped, the slight flicker in the recording. "It's a time-lapse malfunction," he declared, his voice full of dismissive authority. "The camera was skipping frames. Makes it look like it's moving on its own. It's just the nets settling and stretching as they dry." He refused to consider any other possibility. The camera was faulty. The case was closed. The official entry in the supervisor's log for June of 1990 mentions a complaint about damp nets, which was resolved by improving ventilation in the loft. There is no mention of the video or of the terrified testimony of 2 witnesses. Marco Velas finished the season, but he never again felt at peace in the net loft. He couldn't shake the feeling that the building was not just on the edge of the harbor, but that at night, in the deep, quiet hours, the harbor came into the building, its invisible currents and ancient spirits reaching out to reclaim the tools of the trade, to pull the nets back toward the cold, dark water where they belonged. The Aurora drone Kaylin Vance was a doctoral student with a poet's soul and a scientist's mind, a combination that made her perfectly suited to studying the Aurora Borealis. Stationed at the remote Tulloch Field Station in the Alaskan Arctic, her research involved using high-altitude drones to analyze the electromagnetic properties of the northern lights. She loved the aurora, saw it not just as a scientific phenomenon, but as a celestial ballet, a silent, breathtaking performance in the theater of the night sky. The March of 2017 brought with it a solar storm of incredible intensity, promising auroral displays that would be the stuff of legend. For Kaylin, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. Her drone, which she had nicknamed Icarus, was a sophisticated piece of equipment, packed with sensors and capable of reaching altitudes of over 30,000 feet. On the third night of the storm, she prepped Icarus for launch. The sky was not just lit, it was alive. Vast curtains of green and violet light shimmered and pulsed, flowing across the heavens like cosmic rivers. The temperature was a brutal 40 below zero, but Kaylin barely felt it, her attention entirely focused on the sky and her mission. The launch was perfect. Icarus ascended smoothly, a small, dark shape climbing towards the celestial fire. On her monitor in the warmth of the research hut, Kaylin watched the telemetry data stream in. Altitude, airspeed, battery life, all normal. The sensor package was collecting unprecedented data on the charged particles that created the display. She was ecstatic. The drone reached its target altitude, flying a pre-programmed pattern directly through the most intense part of the auroral curtain. It was then that the first anomaly appeared on her screen. The drone's proximity sensors, designed to avoid collisions with other aircraft, began to register multiple contacts. They were high altitude, fast moving, and they were pacing her drone. Her first thought was a flock of migratory birds, but that was impossible at this altitude and temperature. Besides, the contacts were behaving erratically, not like a flock. They were moving against the high-altitude winds, swarming around Icarus with an intelligent, almost playful curiosity. Kaylin switched to the drone's forward-facing, high-definition camera feed. Her breath hitched. The screen showed the stunning ribbon of the aurora, but within it, something else was moving. They were orbs, distinct spheres of light, a brighter, more concentrated green-white than the surrounding aurora. They darted and weaved around the drone, sometimes passing so close they filled the entire screen with an ethereal, blinding light. They were beautiful and utterly terrifying. They were not part of the aurora. They were in it, moving with a volition that defied physics. The telemetry data began to go haywire. The GPS signal flickered and died, scrambled by intense electromagnetic interference. The drone's compass began to spin wildly. The orbs were not just observing. They seemed to be interacting with the drone, their presence overloading its delicate systems. Kaylin watched, her scientific objectivity dissolving into a primal awe and fear. She was witnessing something that had no place in her textbooks, something ancient and alive within the celestial fire. She tried to regain control of Icarus, switching to manual flight mode, but the controls were unresponsive. The drone was no longer hers. It was a toy, a curiosity for the light orbs. The camera feed showed one of the orbs stopping directly in front of the drone, hovering for a moment as if studying the lens. In that instant, Kaylin saw that it wasn't just a ball of light. Inside the glowing sphere, there was a complex shifting pattern, a geometric structure that was constantly rearranging itself. It was intricate, intelligent, and utterly alien. Then, with a final, blinding flash, the feed went dead. The telemetry stream flatlined. Icarus was gone. Kaylin stared at the blank screen, her heart pounding. The drone and all its priceless data had vanished from the sky. She spent the next 2 days in a state of frantic anxiety. The drone was lost, a catastrophic failure for her project. But worse was the memory of what she had seen. She couldn't tell anyone. They would think she was crazy, that the isolation and the strange beauty of the North had finally gotten to her. On the third day, a stroke of impossible luck. A group of surveyors working 20 miles away from the station found the wreckage of the drone. It had crashed in the tundra, its chassis shattered, but miraculously, the hardened memory card containing the flight data and video recordings was intact. Back in the lab, her hands trembling, Kaylin plugged the card into her computer. The data files were there. She clicked on the final video file. The screen filled with the image of the aurora, just as she remembered. The orbs appeared, dancing their impossible dance. She watched, mesmerized, as they swarmed the drone. The final moments of the footage showed the close-up of the orb, its intricate internal geometry shifting and pulsing. And then, for a single frame, a frame so brief it was almost subliminal, the light flickered, and she saw what was inside. It wasn't a pattern. It was a face. Not human, but with eyes. A shape. A form that was undeniably intelligent and aware. The video ended in a blast of static. The university's final report on the incident was dry and technical. It concluded that the drone was lost due to catastrophic sensor failure caused by extreme electromagnetic interference during a geomagnetic storm. The strange lights on the video were dismissed as camera lens flare and sensor artifacts. Common occurrences when filming the aurora. Kaylin Vance completed her doctorate, but she never published the data from that final flight. She kept the memory card, a secret and terrifying piece of evidence. She knew that the aurora was not just a beautiful display of physics, it was a habitat. And she knew that she was not the first person to look up and see the dancers in the fire, but she was one of the few to have looked one of them in the eye. The sky was not empty. It was watching. The pipeline shack, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, is an 800-mile artery of steel and oil, a marvel of modern engineering snaking its way through one of the most hostile environments on Earth. For Liam Brody, a maintenance worker for the Alyeska Pipeline Service Company, it was just a job. A cold, lonely, and often monotonous job. His task in the winter of 2002 was to perform routine inspections on the remote pump station huts that dotted the pipeline's length. Little more than glorified sheds that housed critical monitoring equipment. It was a solitary existence, driving a snowcat for hours through a landscape of blinding white. The pipeline itself, his only guide. The incident happened at Pump Station Hut 73B, a location so remote it didn't even have a name, just a number. It was situated in a flat, featureless expanse of the North Slope, where the wind never stopped, and the silence was so profound it felt like a physical pressure. Liam arrived in the late afternoon, the sun already a distant, weak memory. The hut was a simple windowless metal box. As he approached, he saw something that made him stop. The heavy steel door was barred, not from the outside, as it should be, but from the inside. A thick metal bar, which was supposed to be secured to the interior wall when not in use, had been dropped into the brackets on the door, effectively sealing it shut. Liam stared at it, baffled. The door could only be barred from within. Who could possibly be inside? No maintenance was scheduled. No one else should be out here for 100 miles in any direction. He keyed the radio on his snowcat. Central Control, this is Brody at 73B. I've got a situation here. The pump station hut appears to be barred from the inside. Do you show anyone checked into this location? The voice from Control was staticky but clear. Negative, Brody. You're the only personnel assigned to that sector. We show no keycard access at 73B for the past 72 hours. Can you confirm the door is secured from within? That's affirmative, Control, Liam said, his unease growing. The security bar is in place. I can see the end of it, through the seam. There was a long pause from the other end. The procedures for this were clear, but had never, to anyone's knowledge, been used. It was treated as a potential hostage situation or a medical emergency. Liam was instructed to wait for a security team, but they were hours away. Stuck in the middle of nowhere with a deepening mystery, Liam's curiosity and a creeping sense of dread began a battle in his mind. He decided to check the electronic log. Every keycard swipe was time-stamped and recorded. He pulled the data remotely from his snowcat's terminal. His blood ran cold. According to the log, there had been keycard swipes at Hut 73B. Dozens of them, starting at midnight, and occurring every 15 minutes precisely, all through the night. The card number was unassigned, a ghost in the system. Each swipe had registered as access denied, yet somehow someone had gotten inside and barred the door. Liam was a practical man. He believed in mechanical failures and electrical ghosts, not real ones. He reasoned it had to be a system glitch, a catastrophic malfunction of the card reader. But that didn't explain the bar on the door. He was 100 miles from the nearest road, in the heart of the Arctic winter. The idea of someone being out here without a vehicle, without leaving tracks, and then locking themselves inside a tiny metal hut was more terrifying than any ghost story. Against protocol and against his better judgment, he decided he had to get in. He couldn't just sit there and wait. Using the heavy tools from his snowcat, he spent the next hour working on the door's hinges. The metal screamed in protest against the cold, the sound unnaturally loud in the vast silence. Finally, with a great groan, the door came free, and he was able to pull it open just enough to squeeze inside. The interior of the hut was small, cramped, and filled with the low hum of monitoring equipment. A single bare bulb cast a harsh, sterile light, and it was completely, utterly empty. There was no one there. No sign that anyone had ever been there. No footprints on the dusty floor. No discarded food wrappers. No sleeping bag. Nothing. But the air was warm. Warmer than it should have been from the equipment alone. And on the small maintenance counter, a thermos sat next to a ceramic mug. Liam touched the thermos. It was warm. He unscrewed the cap. Steam rose from it, carrying the faint scent of coffee. The mug beside it was half full, its contents still lukewarm. He backed out of the hut slowly, his mind refusing to connect the dots. The regular, all-night keycard swipes. The door, barred from an empty room. The fresh, warm coffee. It was a set of impossible facts. He looked around the vast, empty landscape, a sea of white stretching to a black horizon. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. He felt a profound, gut-wrenching sense of being watched. He didn't wait for the security team. He radioed in that it had been a false alarm, a mechanical failure with the door bar. He said the keycard log must be malfunctioning. and that he would file a report. He couldn't bring himself to mention the coffee. It was too insane. He secured the door as best he could and drove away from Hut 73B as fast as his snowcat would go, not once looking back. The Alyeska security log from that night in January 2002 shows a resolved issue at Pump Station Hut 73B, attributing it to a faulty locking mechanism. But Liam Brody knew the truth. He had stumbled upon a phantom shift change, a ghostly worker who still manned their post in the loneliest place on Earth. He didn't know who they were, or what they were watching for, but he knew they were still out there, swiping their card every 15 minutes, waiting for a relief that would never come, forever on duty in the cold, humming heart of the pipeline. The Driftwood Fire. Sarah Jensen, a high school science teacher from Juneau, believed in the power of hands-on learning. That's why she brought her environmental science class on a camping trip to the coast near Yakutat every July. It was a chance for the students, kids raised on city streets and smartphone screens, to connect with the raw, untamed beauty of Alaska. The coastline there was a wild, magnificent place, a graveyard of ancient trees washed down from the mountains, their massive trunks and twisted roots bleached bone-white by the sun and salt. It was a landscape of profound and lonely beauty. The tradition on the final night of the trip was always the same: a massive bonfire on the beach, built from the abundant driftwood. It was a celebration, a moment of community against the vast backdrop of the wilderness. The night of July 12th, 2011, was perfect for it. The fire was colossal, a roaring inferno that threw dancing shadows onto the faces of the teenagers and sent a column of sparks spiraling up into the star-dusted sky. They told stories, sang songs, and felt, for a few hours, like the only people on Earth. As the night wound down, Sarah supervised the students in extinguishing the fire, a process she drilled into them with near-religious fervor. They doused it with bucket after bucket of seawater, turning the roaring blaze into a hissing, steaming mass of black slush. They stirred the embers, poured more water, and repeated the process until there was no heat, no smoke, not even a single lingering red glow. The fire was out, cold and dead. They retired to their tents, pitched a safe distance away on the edge of the tree line, the sound of the surf a gentle lullaby. Sarah was the last to fall asleep, doing a final check of the campsite, her flashlight beam confirming the dark, wet patch of sand where their bonfire had been. She was awoken hours later by a shout. "Miss Jensen!" The fire? She scrambled out of her tent, her heart leaping into her throat. The bonfire was blazing again. Not just smoldering or rekindled, but raging, as large and as fierce as it had been at its peak. The flames were a furious orange, consuming a neat, new stack of driftwood that hadn't been there when they went to sleep. The students were all out of their tents, standing in a stunned, silent group, their faces bathed in the impossible light. Sarah's mind raced through the rational explanations. A prank? No, none of the kids would be so reckless, and where would they have gotten the dry wood? A pocket of resin in the old wood reigniting? Possible, but not on this scale, and not after being so thoroughly doused with salt water. She took charge, her teacher's voice cutting through the shocked silence. They went through the process again, this time with a frantic, fearful energy. They hauled water. They dug up the sand around the fire. They made absolutely certain that not a single spark could have survived. By the time they were done, the sun was beginning to rise, painting the eastern sky in soft shades of pink and gray. The fire pit was a waterlogged, sandy mess, the very picture of a safely extinguished campfire. Exhausted and unnerved, they packed up their camp, the usual cheerful chatter replaced by a tense, weary silence. Sarah's last task before they hiked out was to inspect the fire site one final time. She walked over to the spot on the beach, and she stopped, her blood turning to ice. The site was gone. Not the pit, not the blackened wood, not the waterlogged sand. The beach was a smooth, pristine expanse of gray sand, swept clean by the tide. There was no sign that a fire had ever been there. No ash, no charcoal, no disturbed ground. It was as if the entire event, the bonfire, the ghostly rekindling, their frantic efforts to put it out, had been a collective hallucination. The students saw it too. They gathered at the edge of the beach, staring at the empty space, their faces pale with a kind of superstitious dread. One of the boys, a quiet kid named Leo, pointed a trembling finger at the sand. "Look," he whispered. In the damp sand, just at the edge of where the fire should have been, was a single set of footprints. They were not from a hiking boot or a sneaker. They were the prints of a single, large, bare foot, perfectly formed, leading out of the surf, walking once around the invisible fire pit, and then returning to the water. Sarah stared at the footprints, her scientific, rational mind shutting down completely. She had no explanation, no theory, no way to frame what had happened in the logical, ordered world she tried to teach her students about. It was something else, something ancient and primal that belonged to the beach and the sea. The official field trip report she filed with the school district was a masterpiece of omission. It described a successful educational excursion with a note about the importance of fire safety. It did not mention a fire that lit itself, a fire that erased itself from existence, or the lone barefoot track of its keeper. Sarah Jensen continued to teach, but she never took another class camping on that stretch of coast. She couldn't. For her, the beach was no longer just a place of geological interest. It was a place of ritual, a place where, on certain nights, a fire is lit for an unseen audience. She understood now that they had been guests, borrowing a space that was not theirs, and that after they had gone, the true host of the beach had come to tidy up, to erase their clumsy intrusion and relight the fire for reasons of its own. A silent, eternal watchfire on the edge of a timeless sea. The harbor bell. In the autumn of 1985, the city of Juneau was wrapped in its customary blanket of low, persistent fog. For Gus Petrov, a dock worker whose life was governed by the rise and fall of the tides, the fog was just another part of the job. It muffled sound, distorted distances, and gave the harbor a ghostly, ethereal quality. His world was one of creaking piers, the smell of diesel, and the constant mournful cry of foghorns. One of the most familiar sounds in the harbor was the navigation bell on Buoy 7, a deep, resonant clang that marked a dangerous shoal near the main channel. The bell was a simple, reliable mechanism, a set of heavy clappers that swung with the motion of the waves. When the sea was rough, it rang a frantic, chaotic tune. When the sea was calm, it was mostly silent. That September, the sea was unnaturally calm. For a solid week, the Gastineau Channel was like a sheet of dark glass, the water so still you could see the mountains reflected perfectly on its surface. And yet, the bell on Buoy 7 began to ring. It wasn't the random clang of a gentle swell. It was a slow, steady, rhythmic tolling. Dong, dong, dong. Once every 10 seconds, as regular as a clock. At first, no one paid it much mind, but as the days went on, the sound became a source of growing unease among the longshoremen and fishermen. A bell that rang on a calm sea was a bad omen, an old superstition that most men wouldn't admit to believing, but that they all felt in their bones. Gus heard it all day from the docks, and at night he could hear its faint, maddeningly regular toll carrying across the water to his small house on the hillside. Gus was not a superstitious man. He was a man who believed in rust, metal fatigue, and strange currents. He complained to the harbor master, who logged the issue as a potential mechanical failure. A Coast Guard cutter was sent out to inspect the buoy. The divers went down and checked the mooring chain. The technicians went aboard the buoy itself and inspected the bell mechanism. Their report was simple. There was nothing wrong. The buoy was stable, the chain was sound, and the clappers were hanging perfectly still. There was no physical reason for the bell to be ringing. And yet, as the cutter pulled away, the slow, deliberate tolling started up again. Dong, dong, dong. The harbor master, a pragmatic man named O'Connell, was frustrated. He sent a small boat out with a recording device, hoping to analyze the sound for clues. Gus went with them. As they got closer to the buoy, the sound became hypnotic, almost liturgical, like a funeral bell. They circled the massive red and green buoy, its metal hull slick with algae. The water around it was perfectly still, and yet the bell, high above them, continued its somber rhythmic song. They could see the clappers, large hunks of iron, hanging motionless inside the bell's housing. They were not moving. They were not striking the bell, but the sound was coming from it. A deep, resonant tone that vibrated through the hull of their small boat. Gus felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. A sound without a source. A bell that rang without being struck. It was a violation of the laws of nature. Back at the office, they listened to the recording. The audio was crystal clear. The ringing was perfectly rhythmic, each strike an identical twin of the one before it, with a precision that no random wave motion could ever produce. It sounded, for all the world, like someone was deliberately and patiently ringing the bell. The mystery of the phantom bell became the talk of the town. Theories ranged from bizarre underwater acoustic phenomena to Russian submarines. The old Tlingit elders in the community had their own explanation. They said it was the calling of the Kushtaka, the shape-shifting otter men who were said to lure people to their deaths by imitating the cries of women or children. Perhaps, they whispered, they had now learned to imitate the sound of a bell. After 2 weeks of the incessant, ghostly tolling, the harbor master had had enough. It was a distraction, a hazard to navigation if sailors started to distrust their buoys. He gave the order to have buoy 7 removed from the water and replaced. Gus was part of the crew on the maintenance barge that went out to haul the buoy from the channel. It was a heavy, difficult job. As they attached the massive winch cables to the buoy, the bell continued its steady, somber ringing, a final, defiant protest. The moment the buoy was lifted from the water, the moment its connection to the sea was broken, the bell fell silent. The silence was more shocking than the sound had been. On the barge, the crew inspected the bell mechanism one last time. It was in perfect condition. There was no explanation. They towed the silent buoy back to the maintenance yard, a great, mute beast of steel. The new buoy they put in its place remained properly silent on calm days, its bell ringing only when the waves dictated. The old buoy 7 sat in the shipyard for years, a rusting monument to an unsolved mystery. It never made another sound. The harbor master's log for September 1985 notes the replacement of Buoy 7 due to a reported acoustic anomaly. There is no official explanation for the sound, but Gus Petrov, whenever he looked out at the calm gray water of the channel, would sometimes think he could still hear it, a faint, phantom echo. He came to believe that for those 2 weeks, the bell had not been a warning of a shoal, but a marker for something else, something deep under the water that had, for its own unknowable reasons, chosen to announce its presence with the slow, patient, and impossible tolling of a bell. The parked aircraft security guard, Marcus Thorne, liked the graveyard shift at Merrill Field, Anchorage's smaller general aviation airport. It was quiet, peaceful. His job was to make slow, methodical patrols of the taxiways and tie-down areas, ensuring the small Cessnas and Pipers were secure against the long, dark Alaskan night. The winter of 1998 was a cold one, and a heavy snow in early December had blanketed the airfield in a thick layer of white, muffling all sound and turning the familiar landscape into a pristine, alien world. Marcus was on his second patrol of the night, the heater in his security truck blasting, when he saw it. Parked directly on the main taxiway, near the intersection of 2 runways, was an aircraft. It was a twin-engine plane, a design from the 40s or 50s, with a distinctive tail-dragger landing gear and a polished aluminum fuselage that gleamed under the airport lights. It was beautiful. A vintage machine, but it was in a dangerously wrong place. No aircraft was ever to be left on an active taxiway. Marcus grabbed his radio, a surge of adrenaline cutting through his late-night drowsiness. Merrill Tower, Security 1. I have an unauthorized aircraft parked on taxiway Alpha. It's a vintage twin-engine tail-dragger. Can you confirm any scheduled movement? The tower, which operated with a skeleton crew at this hour, was silent for a moment. Then the controller's voice came back, flat and confused. Negative, Security 1. There is nothing on the ground here. Alpha is clear. There are no flight plans filed for anything matching that description. Marcus stared at the plane. It was solid, real, its tires leaving shallow impressions in the fresh snow. He could read the tail number painted on its rudder, N4756C. Tower, I am looking right at it. Tail number is November 4756 Charlie. It's a major runway incursion risk. He could hear the clicking of a keyboard as the controller ran the number. The silence that followed was longer this time. And when the controller spoke again, his voice had lost its professional detachment. It was shaky. Security 1. That tail number is not in the active registry. It belongs to a Stinson trimotor that was reported crashed in the Chugach Mountains. In 1952, it was never recovered. A profound and unnatural chill settled over Marcus, a cold that had nothing to do with the Arctic air outside. He was looking at a ghost plane parked on his taxiway, as solid and real as the truck he was sitting in. He put the truck in park and got out, his heavy boots crunching in the snow. He approached the aircraft cautiously, his flashlight beam dancing across its gleaming rivet-studded skin. It was in perfect condition, not a scratch or a dent on it. The windows of the cockpit were dark, revealing nothing of the interior. There were no footprints in the snow around the plane, other than the ones he was now making. It was as if it had simply been placed there, lowered from the sky. He reached out a gloved hand and touched the fuselage. The metal was real, and it was bitterly, unnaturally cold, far colder than the surrounding air. It felt like touching a block of ancient ice. His radio crackled to life, Security 1, airport manager, is en route. Do not approach the aircraft. Maintain visual and wait for backup. But Marcus was already backing away, a primal fear overriding his training. The silence of the airfield was suddenly oppressive. The presence of the impossible machine, a violation of all known laws. He got back in his truck, locked the doors, and kept his headlights trained on the plane, waiting. He never took his eyes off it. The airport manager and 2 city police officers arrived about 20 minutes later, their headlights cutting through the darkness. They parked beside Marcus, and the manager got out, a large, no-nonsense man named Henderson. He walked over to Marcus's window. "What in the hell is going on, Marcus? The tower says you've got a ghost out here." Marcus just pointed. "It's right there." "See for yourself." Henderson turned and looked, and he stared. His face, illuminated by the dashboard lights, went pale. He stood there for a long moment, then walked slowly toward the Stinson, the police officers following, their hands on their sidearms. They circled it, their flashlights playing over its silent form. Their conversation was a confused murmur on the wind. Then a gust of wind swept across the airfield, kicking up a thick cloud of swirling snow. For a moment, visibility dropped to 0. The world outside the truck, a blinding vortex of white. The squall passed as quickly as it had come, lasting no more than 30 seconds. When it cleared, the taxiway was empty. The Stinson trimeter was gone. Henderson and the 2 officers were standing in the middle of the empty taxiway, staring at the space where the plane had been. They slowly walked back to the security truck, their faces masks of disbelief. "It's gone," Henderson said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It just vanished." They all looked at the ground. Where the massive aircraft had sat moments before, the snow was pristine, untouched. Their own footprints were there. The tire tracks from their vehicles were there. But the deep impressions from the plane's landing gear, the tracks Marcus had seen so clearly, were gone. It had not taken off. It had not been towed. It had simply ceased to be. The official Anchorage Airport security log for that night in December 1998 has an entry that is both detailed and maddeningly vague. It reports an unidentified obstruction on Taxiway Alpha, which was confirmed by 4 witnesses. It concludes that the obstruction was cleared by unknown means before it could be properly identified. The tail number N4756C is not mentioned. Marcus Thorne worked at Merrill Field for another 10 years, but he never again saw the ghost plane. But the memory of it, gleaming and impossibly cold under the winter lights, never left him. He knew that for a few brief hours, a wrinkle in time had opened up on that snowy taxiway, and a flight that had gone missing half a century ago had, for reasons no one could ever understand, finally come home to land. The tundra cabin music. The work of an oil survey crew on the north slope of Alaska is a study in sensory deprivation. The landscape outside Prudhoe Bay in April is an endless, soul-crushing expanse of white, a flat, frozen desert under a vast and indifferent sky. For Dave Chen and his 3-man team, the days were a monotonous routine of drilling core samples and recording seismic data. Their only companions the constant hum of their equipment and the howl of the Arctic wind. Their world was contained within the warm cab of their tracked vehicle and the data on their computer screens. It was during a long traverse in April of 2006 that they first heard it. It came through their shortwave radio, a device they used for communicating with their base camp. But this wasn't a voice. It was music, faint tinny and distorted by static, but unmistakably music. It was the sound of a fiddle playing a lively, cheerful jig, a sound so out of place in the frozen emptiness that at first they thought it was a prank, a recording being played by one of the other crews. Dave keyed the mic. "I'm Base Camp. This is Survey Team Bravo. We're picking up some strange audio on this channel. Sounds like music. Are you guys messing with us?" The reply from Base was immediate. "Negative, Bravo. We hear it too. We thought it was you. We've been trying to triangulate the source. It's not coming from any known broadcast. It seems to be..." Local Dave and his team looked at each other, a shared sense of unease passing between them. Local? Out here? There was nothing for 200 miles in any direction but ice, snow, and the occasional oil derrick. They were the only people out here. As they continued their traverse, the music grew stronger, the static fading until the cheerful, energetic melody of the fiddle was perfectly clear. It was a joyful, infectious tune, the kind of music you'd hear at a country dance, and its presence in this desolate landscape was deeply, profoundly unsettling. Their directional antenna indicated the signal was coming from a point just a few miles ahead. Curiosity, mixed with a growing sense of dread, compelled them to investigate. They crested a low ridge and saw it, a small dark shape on the horizon, the only feature in the endless white. As they got closer, they saw it was a cabin, an old, dilapidated hunting cabin, its timbers weathered gray by the years, its windows boarded up, its roof heavy with snow. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades, and the music was pouring out of it, so loud now that they could hear it faintly even outside the vehicle, over the rumble of the engine. Dave parked the vehicle a safe distance away and they got out. The cheerful fiddle music, a bizarre, almost manic soundtrack to the desolate scene. The air was frigid, the wind sharp. There were no tracks around the cabin, no sign of a snowmobile, no footprints. The snow was a smooth, undisturbed blanket that had clearly been lying there all winter. Yet the music played on, seeming to emanate from the very walls of the derelict structure. One of the crew, a burly man named Mike, pulled a heavy pry bar from their toolkit. "I'm going in," he said, his voice tight. "I gotta see what this is." It took him a few minutes of hard work to pry the boards off the door, the screech of rusty nails loud against the relentless music. He pushed the door open. It swung inward into darkness. The music stopped. The sudden, absolute silence was more shocking than the sound had been. It crashed down on them, a physical weight. The only sound now was the wind. Dave shone a powerful flashlight into the cabin. The single room was empty. There was no furniture, no stove, no sign of recent occupation. The floor was thick with dust and debris. There were no instruments, no radio, no speakers, nothing that could have produced the music. The only thing out of the place were several small, distinct puddles of melted snow on the floor, as if something warm had been sitting there just moments before. But the cabin was as cold as a tomb. They searched the small space thoroughly. There was no power source, no hidden device. It was just an empty, abandoned shell. They backed out, their minds reeling, and secured the door as best they could. As they walked back to their vehicle, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It was as if the musician, the phantom fiddler, was still inside, silently observing them from the darkness. They got back in the cab and sat for a long moment in silence, the cheerful tune still echoing in their heads. Dave picked up the radio microphone, then put it down again. What could he possibly say? He turned the key in the ignition. As the engine rumbled to life, so did the radio. And with it, the music, the same lively fiddle jig, starting up again from the beginning, as if its brief interruption had been nothing more than a momentary pause. They didn't stay to listen. Dave put the vehicle in gear and drove away from the cabin as fast as he could, the cheerful, manic music chasing them for miles until it finally faded back into the static. The survey field log for that day in April 2006, filed by Dave Chen, notes significant radio interference from an unknown source in that sector. It recommends that all future crews avoid the area due to potential equipment malfunction. It makes no mention of a cabin or of music. Dave and his crew never spoke of it again, but none of them could ever forget the sound of that joyful, impossible fiddle. A ghost of a party still happening in an empty room. A defiant spark of life in the dead, frozen heart of the tundra. The mountain weather balloon for Mr. Harrison's 11th grade physics class in Talkeetna. It was the most exciting day of the school year. The high-altitude weather balloon project was a chance to escape the classroom and engage with science in a real, tangible way. The goal was simple: to launch a balloon carrying a payload of sensors and a GPS tracker, to see how high it could go and what data it could collect from the edge of space. The day of the launch in May 2014 was perfect, clear and bright, with the majestic peak of Denali dominating the horizon. The students, bundled in jackets, worked with a focused excitement, checking the helium levels, calibrating the sensors, and attaching the small, insulated box containing the GPS unit and cameras. Mr. Harrison, a teacher named David who believed in fostering curiosity, supervised with a proud smile. With a final countdown, they released the balloon. It shot upwards, a brilliant white sphere against the deep blue sky, shrinking rapidly as it climbed. Back in the classroom, they huddled around a laptop, watching the GPS data stream in. A red dot on a digital map tracked the balloon's ascent, moving steadily eastward with the prevailing high-altitude winds. The numbers on the screen climbed rapidly. 10,000 feet, 20,000, 50,000 feet. The students cheered with each milestone. They were watching the live feed from the camera, the curved horizon of the Earth becoming visible, the sky above turning from blue to a deep, dark indigo. Then, at an altitude of 92,400 feet, something strange happened. The balloon stopped. It wasn't that the signal was lost. The GPS was still transmitting perfectly. The data showed that the balloon had ceased all movement. It was not ascending. It was not descending. And it was not drifting with the wind. It was hovering, fixed in a single point in the stratosphere, as if it had been pinned to the sky. Mr. Harrison frowned, leaning closer to the screen. "That's not possible," he murmured. The students fell silent, their celebratory mood replaced by a quiet confusion. One of the more astute students, a girl named Chloe, refreshed the live NOAA wind data for their region. She pointed to her screen. "Mr. Harrison, look. NOAA is reporting winds of over 120 miles per hour at that altitude. It should be halfway to Canada by now." But it wasn't. The red dot on their map remained stubbornly, impossibly stationary. For the next 2 hours, the entire class was mesmerized, glued to the screen. They watched the data feed, expecting the balloon to burst as it was designed to, or for the GPS to finally show it moving. But it did neither. It just hung there, in the near vacuum of the upper atmosphere. in defiance of all the laws of physics they had been studying. Mr. Harrison made a call to a friend at the university's atmospheric sciences department, explaining the situation. The professor was baffled. He confirmed the wind data. He agreed that what they were seeing was, by all accounts, physically impossible. A balloon could not remain stationary in a jet stream. There was no known atmospheric phenomenon, no inversion layer or strange pressure pocket that could account for it. The camera feed was still active, though it had started to flicker. It showed the blackness of space, the brilliant sun, the thin, curved line of the Earth's atmosphere below. There was nothing else, just the vast, silent emptiness. Then, after 2 hours and 17 minutes of this impossible stillness, the signal cut out. All of it. The GPS, the sensor data, the camera feed, everything went dead at the same instant. The red dot vanished from their map. The project was over. The balloon and its payload were lost. In the days that followed, Mr. Harrison tried to formulate a plausible explanation for his students. He talked about potential GPS malfunctions, where the unit freezes on its last known coordinates, even though he knew the constant stream of other data, like temperature and pressure, had also frozen at the same moment. He talked about equipment failure in the extreme cold. He tried to turn it into a lesson about the unpredictability of real-world experiments. But the students weren't buying it. They had all seen it. They had all witnessed the 2-hour-long miracle, or violation, that had occurred 90,000 feet above their heads. They had seen something that science, as they knew it, could not explain. The official school science project report, filed by Mr. Harrison, concludes with a section on anomalous GPS data. It hypothesizes that a software glitch caused the tracker to lock, and that the balloon was likely carried away by the wind as expected before its eventual descent. It was a neat, tidy, and completely dishonest explanation. David Harrison never told anyone, not the other teachers, not even his wife, about what he saw in the final few frames of the video feed before it cut out. As he was reviewing the corrupted video file later that night, trying to salvage any usable data, he noticed a flicker, a distortion in the last few seconds of the transmission. He slowed it down, frame by frame. For a fraction of a second, a shadow fell across the camera lens. It was not a bird, not another aircraft. It was vast, dark, and angular, a shape that blotted out the stars. It was something that had come alongside the balloon in the silent emptiness of the stratosphere, something that had held it steady against the hurricane-force winds. He didn't know what it was, but he knew that it had been there. The balloon hadn't been hovering. It had been held. It had been inspected. And then, its purpose served, it had been taken. The ferry dining room, the MV Columbia, the flagship of the Alaska Marine Highway System, was a world unto itself, a floating town on a slow, deliberate journey through the majestic labyrinth of the Inside Passage. For Liam, a young cook in the ship's galley, it was a life of routine, governed by the strict timetables of meal service. His job was to transform pallets of frozen and canned goods into passable meals for the hundreds of passengers and crew. It was hard, repetitive work, but there was a certain peace to the rhythm of it. The most tedious part of his day was the late-night prep for the breakfast service. After the last dinner guest had left, it was his responsibility to set the tables in the main dining room for the morning. It was a task he performed on autopilot, a precise ballet of polished silverware, folded napkins, and perfectly aligned water glasses, repeated at 60 different tables. The night of November 4th, 2007, the ferry was on a smooth, calm stretch of water between Sitka and Juneau. Liam finished his work around midnight, the dining room a pristine and orderly sea of white tablecloths. He locked the doors to the room, as was procedure, and headed to his cramped cabin for a few hours of sleep before his 4 a.m. wake-up call. When his alarm went off, he dragged himself back to the galley. He unlocked the dining room doors, ready to begin the final breakfast preparations. He stopped dead in the doorway, a feeling of profound disorientation washing over him. Every single table had been reset. It wasn't a mess. It wasn't vandalism. It was the opposite. Each fork, each knife, each spoon was in its correct place, but they were all in the wrong correct place. The dinner fork was where the salad fork should be. The water glass was on the left instead of the right. The napkin was folded in a different style. It was a mirror image, a perfect, deliberate, and completely incorrect inversion of the way he had said it just 4 hours earlier. His first thought was that it was a prank, a classic bit of hazing by the veteran crew members. He was furious. It would take him an hour to fix it. He stormed into the galley, accusing the other cooks, who were just starting their shift. They all denied it, looking at him with genuine confusion. They had been asleep. The dining room had been locked. His supervisor, a stern, no-nonsense woman named Maria, came to see what the commotion was about. She looked at the tables, her lips tightening. She too assumed it was a prank, and she was not amused. "This is a waste of company time," she said, her voice sharp. "Fix it and find out who did this." To settle the matter, she went to the purser's office to review the security camera footage from the dining room. Liam went back to his work, his anger simmering as he methodically reset every single piece of silverware on every single table. 20 minutes later, Maria returned. Her face was pale. She was holding the tape from the CCTV camera. She said nothing, just beckoned Liam and the other cooks to follow her to the small office where a VCR and monitor were kept. "Watch this," she whispered. The footage was time-stamped, showing the empty dining room after Liam had locked up. For the first 2 hours, the image was still, a silent, black-and-white tableau of empty tables. Then, at 2:13 a.m., it started. On a table in the foreground, a fork lifted into the air. It hovered for a second, then gently placed itself down on the other side of the plate. Then a knife, then a spoon. The camera, a low frame rate model, captured the movement in a series of jerky, skipped frames. It wasn't a smooth motion. It was a sequence of still images. The fork is here, then suddenly, the fork is there. There was no hand, no wire, no visible cause. It was simply happening. They watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the phenomenon spread through the room. Table by table, the silverware rearranged itself with a silent, methodical precision. It was like watching a time-lapse video of an invisible, meticulous waiter setting the tables for a banquet of ghosts. Glasses slid across tablecloths, napkins unfolded and refolded themselves into new shapes. The entire room was remade by an unseen, silent force. The event lasted for nearly an hour. When it was done, the room was still again, every table perfectly and incorrectly set. Liam and the other cooks stared at the screen, their earlier anger replaced by a creeping, supernatural dread. They were on a ship in the middle of the ocean, a self-contained world. And they were not alone. Maria made a decision. She ejected the tape, walked over to the galley's incinerator, and dropped it in. "This never happened," she said, her voice low and firm. No one is to speak of this. The passengers can never know. We will blame it on a camera malfunction. Do you understand?" They all nodded, a silent pact of disbelief and fear. The galley supervisor's log for that voyage contains a single terse entry for November 5th. "CCTV in dining room malfunctioning. Requires service." The passengers who ate breakfast that morning never knew that their tables had been set twice, once by a tired young cook, and once by something else entirely. Something that had come out in the deep, quiet hours of the night to impose its own strange and silent order on the world. Liam never felt comfortable in the dining room again. He would always feel a chill in the air, the sense of an unseen presence just at the edge of his vision, a meticulous ghost forever concerned with the proper placement of a spoon. The Avalanche Cabin Hatcher Pass in winter is a place of sublime and terrifying beauty. The mountains are sharp, white, and utterly indifferent to human life. For Chloe, an experienced backcountry skier, it was a paradise. She sought the solitude, the thrill of carving fresh tracks in deep powder, and the profound silence of the high country. In February of 2018, she was on a solo, multi-day trip, a journey that required careful planning and a deep respect for the power of the mountains. A storm was forecast, and she had planned her route to be near one of the small public-use cabins that dotted the pass, a tiny wooden sanctuary against the elements. As the first flakes began to fall, she reached the cabin, a simple A-frame structure tucked into a bowl just below a massive, avalanche-prone slope known as the Dragon's Back. Before settling in, she did what any experienced skier would do. She used her satellite phone to check the latest report from the Alaska Avalanche Center. The bulletin sent a jolt of fear through her. It was a special warning, a red flag alert. The new snowfall, combined with a weak underlying layer in the snowpack, had created extremely unstable conditions. The forecast for the Dragon's Back was not just a risk of collapse, it was a near certainty. The bulletin stated, with chilling finality, that a major avalanche event was expected within the next 12 hours. Chloe was in the direct path of a monster. Her training took over. She couldn't outrun it. She couldn't climb out of the bowl. The cabin was her only hope. She checked its construction. It was solid, well anchored, but she knew that a large enough slide would obliterate it as if it were a child's toy. There was nothing to do but wait and hope. She spent the night in a state of high alert, her sleeping bag laid out on the floor, away from the windows. Every groan of the cabin's wood, every gust of wind, sent her heart racing. She listened for the telltale sound, the deep, thunderous roar of 1,000,000 tons of snow and ice breaking free. But the night passed in an unnerving, absolute silence, broken only by the soft, steady sound of falling snow. She woke at dawn to a strange, diffuse blue light filling the cabin. The windows were completely covered. She pushed open the door and was met with a solid wall of snow. The cabin had been buried. A part of her was relieved. The slide had happened, and she had survived. The cabin had held. Now began the long, arduous process of digging herself out. She had an emergency shovel and she set to work, carving a tunnel upwards toward the surface. It took her over an hour of exhausting labor before she finally broke through into the daylight. She pulled herself out of the hole and stood up, her jaw dropping at the scene before her. The Dragon's Back had indeed released. The entire slope was a chaotic jumble of fractured snow slabs and debris, a testament to the immense power of the avalanche. The path of the slide had come directly down the mountain, straight towards her cabin. But The cabin itself was sitting in a strange, pristine pocket of untouched snow. The avalanche had split, flowing around the tiny structure on both sides, like a river parting around a stone. The debris field started again just a few feet beyond the cabin walls. It was a miracle, a 1 in a million chance. But that wasn't the strangest part. As she looked more closely, she realized that the snow she had just tunneled through, the snow that had buried her door and covered her windows, was not part of the avalanche. It was just the deep, light powder from the overnight storm. There was no sign of the heavy, compacted debris that an avalanche leaves behind. The cabin hadn't been impacted at all. It was as if the slide had happened, but it had somehow passed through the space the cabin occupied without touching it. Her mind struggled to reconcile the two realities. The overwhelming evidence of the massive slide on the slope above, and the pristine, untouched snow surrounding her tiny shelter. It was a physical impossibility. She pulled out her satellite phone again and loaded the updated Avalanche Center report. Her blood ran cold as she read the new entry. The bulletin from the previous night had been updated. It now noted that while conditions were extreme, a flyover that morning had shown no evidence of a major avalanche. The official report stated, "Expected avalanche event on Dragon's Back not observed." Not observed, but she was standing in the middle of the debris field. She could see the fracture line high up on the mountain where the snow had broken free. She was a witness to an event that, according to the official record, had never happened. She was standing in the aftermath of a ghost avalanche. The feeling that washed over her was a cold, quiet dread, far more profound than the fear of being buried alive. She had not been lucky. She had been overlooked. The mountain had unleashed its fury, but it had somehow chosen to ignore the small, insignificant spot where she was hiding. It had erased the event from the official record, leaving her as the sole, unbelievable witness. She packed her gear in a daze, her earlier feelings of triumph and survival replaced by a sense of being a trespasser in a world of incomprehensible power. As she skied away, she kept looking back at the tiny cabin, sitting peacefully in its impossible pocket of calm, a silent monument to a storm that both happened and did not happen. The official record from the Alaska Avalanche Center for that day in February 2018 shows a period of high risk, but no major slides. Chloe's story, if she ever told it, would be dismissed as the confused perception of a skier caught in a storm, but she knew the truth. She had spent a night in a place that had, for a few crucial hours, been politely excused from the laws of physics, a silent, terrifying act of grace from a mountain that held the power to both destroy and to forget. The oil derrick lights. The Cook Inlet in August is a place of stark contrasts. The long, lingering twilight of the subarctic summer, casting a strange, ethereal glow over the cold, gray water and the rusting steel giants that dotted the horizon. These were the oil derricks, some active and blazing with light, others long abandoned, silent skeletons waiting to be dismantled. For Jed, a night shift roughneck on the Osprey platform, the abandoned derricks were just part of the scenery, familiar and ignored. His life was a loud, greasy, and dangerous routine, a constant battle with heavy machinery and the ever-present risk of a blowout. The summer of 1991 was his 5th year on the rigs, and he thought he'd seen it all. He was taking a break on the deck, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the last of the sun disappear when he saw it. Far to the south, the lights on Platform Gamma flickered on, a string of bright, white deck lights, illuminating the entire structure. Jed frowned. Platform Gamma had been decommissioned for at least a decade. It was a cold, dark and rusting hulk, completely without power. He'd been on the salvage assessment team himself a few years back. The generators had been removed, the cables cut. There was no electricity on that rig. He called over his supervisor, a grizzled veteran named Mac. "Hey Mac, you see that? Looks like someone's having a party over on Gamma." Mac followed his gaze, squinting into the twilight. He swore under his breath. "What in the hell? That's impossible. That rig's been dead for years." They weren't the only ones to see it. Soon, half the night crew was lining the rail, staring at the ghostly, illuminated platform across the water. The lights weren't flickering. They were burning with a steady, solid brilliance, as if a full crew had just shown up and fired up the main generator. The call to the company headquarters on the mainland was filled with confusion. The dispatcher confirmed what they already knew. Gamma was offline, scheduled for demolition. There were no crews authorized to be on board. The immediate assumption was pirates or vandals, a serious security breach. A crew boat was dispatched from the mainland, carrying a team of security guards. Jed and his crew watched from the Osprey as the boat sped across the inlet, its searchlight cutting a bright path through the dark water. As the boat got closer to Gamma, the lights on the abandoned derrick went out. Not all at once, but one by one, as if someone were walking the decks, methodically flipping switches, plunging the rig back into darkness. By the time the security boat arrived, Platform Gamma was once again a dark, silent silhouette against the sky. The security team boarded the rig, their flashlights sweeping across the rusting, empty decks. Their radio transmissions back to the mainland painted a picture of total dereliction. The rig was deserted. There were no signs of forced entry. The generator room was filled with cobwebs and gutted machinery. There was no power source. There was no physical way the lights could have been turned on. But the report came back with one unsettling detail. The thermal imaging camera showed residual heat signatures. The large floodlight housings on the main deck were still warm, as were the main electrical breaker panels. Something had been drawing a massive amount of power just minutes before they arrived. But from where? The security team found nothing else. No footprints in the grime, no discarded tools, no sign of any human presence. The incident was officially logged as an unexplained visual phenomenon, with the leading theory being a bizarre atmospheric reflection of their own rig's lights off a layer of fog. But there was no fog that night. The air was crystal clear. Jed knew what he saw. The entire crew knew what they saw. It wasn't a reflection. It was a ghost crew, reporting for a shift on a rig that no longer existed. They had come back to their posts, turned on the lights, and done their work in the silent heart of the night, their phantom energy leaving behind only a fleeting, impossible warmth. After that night, the crews on the active rigs in Cook Inlet started telling a new story. They said that if you looked closely at the abandoned platforms on a clear night, you could sometimes see a single, faint light, like a welder's torch, burning high up on the derrick. They said it was the old hands, the men who had spent their lives on those rigs, still out there, keeping watch, forever bound to the cold steel and the deep, dark water below. The maintenance log for the Osprey platform from August 1991 contains a brief entry about the sighting, but it's crossed out with a handwritten note beside it. Per management, disregard, atmospheric anomaly. But for Jed and the others, it was no anomaly. It was a reminder that some men never clock out, their spirits still illuminating the darkness long after the power has been cut. The railroad echo, the Alaska Railroad in January, is a lifeline, a thin steel thread running through a world of white. For locomotive engineer Frank Keller, a man who had spent 30 years of his life in the cab of a train, The route near Healy was one of the most beautiful and treacherous. The tracks twisted through deep canyons, their granite walls close enough to touch, their surfaces caked in a thick armor of ice. The year was 1974, a time before sophisticated digital communication, a time when the language of the railroad was the lonely blast of the horn and the rhythmic clatter of steel on steel. Frank was at the controls of a long freight train, hauling supplies north. The snow was falling heavily, reducing visibility and creating a hypnotic, dreamlike landscape. As they entered a particularly narrow section of the canyon, known to the crews as the echo chamber, Frank sounded the horn, a standard safety procedure for blind curves. 2 long blasts, a short, then another long, the mournful, powerful sound echoing off the canyon walls. He released the pull cord and waited for the echo to die down. Instead, he heard a response. From somewhere up ahead, around the bend, came an identical blast of a horn. 2 long, a short, a long. It was the perfect mirror of his own signal. Frank's hand tensed on the brake. His conductor, a young man named Bobby, leaned forward from his seat. "What was that? Is there another train on this track?" It was a terrifying thought. A head-on collision in this canyon would be catastrophic. Frank grabbed the radio, his voice urgent. "Dispatch, this is Engine 58 North. I have a possible train ahead on the main line in the Healy Canyon." I heard a horn response. Please advise the reply from the dispatcher was crackly but immediate. -58. You are the only traffic on that line for the next 50 miles. There is nothing ahead of you. The track is clear to Fairbanks. Frank and Bobby stared at each other. The dispatcher was never wrong. The block signal system was foolproof, but they had both heard it. It wasn't an echo. An echo degrades. It becomes distorted. This was a clean, crisp, powerful sound, as if from another locomotive just around the corner. "Maybe it's the echo in this canyon," Bobby suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Maybe it just sounds different in the snow." Frank shook his head. He'd run this canyon 1,000 times. He knew its echoes. This was not one of them. He slowed the train to a crawl, its massive engines groaning in protest. He sounded the horn again, a single, short blast. A moment later, a single, short blast answered from the darkness ahead. It was mocking him, playing a game. Bobby pointed out his window. "Frank, look." The spur to their right was an old, unused track spur, its rails almost completely buried in snow. It veered off the main line and disappeared into a dark, narrow side canyon. The switch that connected it to the main line had been removed decades ago. It was a dead track, leading nowhere. "That spur's been closed since the 50s, Frank said, his voice low. "The rails were pulled for scrap 20 years ago." And yet, the sound seemed to be coming from that direction, from the dark mouth of the side canyon where no track existed. A cold dread, colder than the Alaskan winter, began to seep into the warmth of the cab. This was railroad land, a place with a long and often tragic history. Every mile of track had a story, a memory. They rounded the final bend, their headlights cutting a bright path through the falling snow. The main line ahead was empty, a pristine ribbon of steel stretching into the distance. There was no train. There was nothing. They passed the dead spur, its entrance a dark, foreboding gash in the rock. As they drew level with it, they both heard another sound, not a horn this time, but the faint, rhythmic clatter of wheels on a track and the hiss of steam, a sound that hadn't been heard on this railroad in a generation. It seemed to come from just inside the dark canyon, and it faded as they passed. They didn't speak for the next hour. There was nothing to say. They had heard a ghost, a phantom train running a phantom route, a memory of the rails so strong it could still sound its horn in a winter storm. When they finally reached Fairbanks, Frank filed his report. He mentioned the horn, but allowed the dispatcher to log it as an unusual acoustic echo caused by atmospheric conditions. He didn't mention the sound of steam or the dead track spur. It was a story best left in the canyon. The Alaska Railroad operator log for January 1974 shows the report, a minor anomaly in a day of routine operations. But Frank Keller, on his subsequent runs through the Healy Canyon, would sometimes cut his own engine back to idle and just listen. And on rare occasions when the snow was falling just right and the world was quiet, he would hear it again. The faint, lonely call of another train, forever running a schedule of its own. Its echo a permanent resident of the cold, dark, and haunted canyon. The clinic generator, the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, is a vast, flat, and waterlogged expanse of tundra, a place where the line between land and water is often blurred. The town of Bethel is a regional hub, a small island of relative modernity in a sea of ancient wilderness. For Nurse Anna Petrova, the local health clinic was the front line, a place of constant challenge and deep reward. The clinic was the only source of advanced medical care for thousands of square miles, and its most critical piece of equipment was not a defibrillator or an X-ray machine, but the big diesel generator in the shed out back. In the brutal Alaskan winters, power outages were common, and the generator was literally a matter of life and death. The night of November 18th, 2009, was a bad one. A blizzard of historic intensity had descended on the region, with hurricane-force winds and blinding snow. The power grid, as expected, failed. The lights in the clinic flickered and died, plunging the building into a sudden, terrifying darkness. A moment later, the backup systems kicked in. The emergency lights glowed dimly, and from outside, they heard the reassuring, throaty roar of the diesel generator starting up. Anna and the small skeleton crew on duty breathed a collective sigh of relief. They had patients on ventilators, refrigerated medicines, and a waiting room full of people seeking shelter from the storm. The generator was their lifeline. The storm raged for hours. The generator ran flawlessly, a steady, rhythmic thrum against the chaos of the blizzard. Around 3 a.m., the on-duty maintenance engineer, a man named George, came to Anna with a worried look on his face. "We have a problem," he said, his voice low. "The generator is running on empty. The fuel gauge is on 0. I've checked the tank visually. It's dry. It should have shut down an hour ago." Anna felt a knot of panic tighten in her stomach. How is that possible? When was it last filled? "Yesterday morning," George said, shaking his head. "It's a 24-hour tank. With this load, it should have been good for a few more hours. Either the gauge is wrong or we burned through fuel way faster than we should have. There was no way to refuel it in the middle of the blizzard." They were on their own. They began to prepare for the inevitable, getting manual respirators ready, packing the critical medicines in snow to keep them cold. They waited for the reassuring roar of the generator to sputter and die. But it didn't. It kept running for another hour, then another. Its rhythm never faltered. Its pitch never changed. It just kept running, providing steady, reliable power to the clinic, even as its fuel tank remained demonstrably empty. George was beside himself, a man whose entire life was based on the predictable laws of internal combustion, watching those laws be utterly and completely defied. He hooked up a diagnostic computer to the generator's control panel. The data that came back made no sense. The engine was running at optimal RPMs. The power output was stable, and the fuel consumption log registered a flat, perfect zero. It was a ghost in the machine, an engine running on nothing. The generator continued to run for another 2 full hours after its fuel supply was exhausted. Then, just as the first hint of dawn began to break and the storm showed signs of weakening, the main power grid came back online. The lights in the clinic flickered, then burned with their full, steady brightness. The automated transfer switch did its job, and the load was taken off the generator. The moment the clinic was back on grid power, the generator sputtered once, coughed a plume of black smoke, and fell silent. The silence was deafening. George tried to restart it later that day, after refueling the tank. It wouldn't start. The engine had ceased. A team of engineers was flown in from Anchorage the next day. They took the entire generator apart. Their conclusion was baffling. The engine was destroyed, its pistons fused to the cylinder walls, a result of having been run for an extended period with no fuel, and therefore no lubrication. According to their analysis, the engine should have torn itself to pieces within minutes of running dry. It should not have been able to run for 2 more hours. It should not have been able to run for 2 more seconds. The final facility report, filed with the Yukon-Kuskokwim Health Corporation, is a masterpiece of technical jargon and understatement. It notes the failure of the backup generator during a power outage and attributes the engine seizure to a catastrophic fuel gauge malfunction, leading to unexpected fuel depletion. There is no mention of the impossible 2 hours. It's a story that is not in any official record, but it is told in whispers by the nurses and staff who were there that night. They don't believe it was a mechanical miracle. The clinic is built on old Yupik land, a place of powerful spirits. They believe that something heard their prayers that night, that something understood what was at stake. They believe that an ancient, benevolent force reached into the heart of their modern machine and kept it running, not on diesel, but on sheer will. A quiet, impossible act of compassion in the heart of a deadly storm.